Good morning, Dr. Mel. Good morning, classmates. I'm here to report to you my assigned topic for Com 380 Module 3 Theoretical Foundation of Social Mobilization. My part is Stakeholders Mobilization, New Social Movements Theory, and Mediated Mobilization. Our target learning outcomes for this presentation include to know how stakeholders are mobilized, to understand key concepts in new social movements theory, and to be able to identify the impact of ICT and media on stakeholder mobilization. Before we move further, let us review the definition of stakeholder. So stakeholder is an individual, group, institution, organization, or business that could affect or be affected by the outcome of a particular activity, process, or project, either positively or negatively. There are two types of stakeholders. The first one are the primary stakeholders. They are the persons, groups, organizations who are actively involved in an activity and are directly affected by the participatory approach and can significantly influence the process or project. The second type are the secondary stakeholders. They are not directly involved in or affected by an activity or the participatory approach. They may be indirectly affected or are interested and willing to participate in the process in different ways and stages. Let's now move on to stakeholder mobilization. Stakeholder mobilization is the beginning of the participation process and entails one-to-one communication between the proponents and stakeholders to inform them, collect information, assess the situation, among others. At the left side of the screen, you can see a sample framework from the Department of Water Affairs and Forestry of the Republic of South Africa. As you can see, the phase one of the stakeholder participation involves the stakeholder mobilization. It is often used to describe the process by which stakeholders are first introduced to participatory approaches. It is the initial process of getting stakeholders interested and aware of the concept of participation and all that entails. Gaining trust of the stakeholders and identifying and involving key persons are common practices to ensure effective participation process and to avoid conflicts. So how do we mobilize stakeholders? Based from the framework that I have previously shared with you, there are 5 steps that we can use in order to mobilize our stakeholders and later make them participate. First, we should have situation analysis. We need to engage with communities using the appropriate methods for gathering information and conduct an analysis of the existing projects or initiatives in the area. Second, we need to have an initial stakeholder analysis. To do this, we need to establish a stakeholder list by engaging with communities and stakeholders, which are in some way or another connected to the advocacy. So the stakeholder analysis should reveal the interests, contribution, potential problems, and networking capabilities of stakeholders. Third, identify constraints and potential pitfalls. It is important that we identify which circumstances or existing issues could have an effect on participation. We need to determine whether prior controversy existed on the same or similar issues. We should be prepared to address these issues when they emerge during the discussion, after which we need to assess people's perception on the issue related to the advocacy. Fourth, determine the level of participation. It may at this stage be possible to decide on the level and type of participatory interactions. So in order for us to do this, we can ask questions like, how significant are future decisions for the stakeholders' livelihood, or what's the level of stakeholder interest and availability for the future project? So if these are high, then the level of participation should be high. Also, the available resources, specifically financial resources and expertise, may determine the level of participation. Or this can be the other way around, wherein the level of participation will determine what resources are needed. Fifth, call for a meeting. Once the above activities are complete, a meeting or gathering of some form should be organized where participatory roles and process are discussed. You can plan and formalize everything there. So invitations to participate in such a gathering can be in various forms. Now let's talk about the new social movements theory. New social movements theory emerged in the 1970s to explain the proliferation of post-industrial, quality of life movements that are difficult to analyze using traditional social movement theories. Alberto Melucci has a very significant set of contributions in this theory. We have constructivist approach, collective identity, submerged networks, and complex societies. Now, let's talk about the first contribution of Melucci, the constructivist approach. It addresses how individuals get involved in collective action, how actors construct collective action in unity, and how one can get at the meaning which is produced out of heterogeneity and plurality. This claims that by understanding the actions and processes, and by fostering sensitivity to the plurality of meanings, orientations, and relationships, one can seek to understand crucial aspects of contemporary social movements obscured by other approaches. The characteristics of contemporary movements which bring together diverse actors with varying goals, multiple identities, and the like, combined with a contemporary commitment to respecting and protecting difference in diversity, does not complicate the problem of solidarity. Let's now talk about collective identity. It is not equivalent to mobilizing interests, but it requires an intermediate level of analysis which brings into relief how individuals come to decide that they share certain orientations and decide to act collectively. The arguments about expectations are dependent upon a conceptualization of the role of collective identity. The expectations are formulated by actors who are capable of defining themselves and the field of their action. The replacement of the view on collective action as a unified empirical datum with the notion that it is a product of continual tensions, negotiations, and cognitive processes within a multipolar action system, a composite action system in which widely differing means, ends, and forms of solidarity and organization converge in a more or less stable manner. Another concept advanced by Melucci is the submerged networks. These are small groups submerged in everyday life which require a personal involvement and produce alternative frameworks of meaning which put into practice the alternative meanings which they produce and reproduce. It contends that contemporary movements operate primarily as signs and not preoccupied with the production and distribution of material goods and services, but have systemic effects predominantly in rendering power visible. The last concept under the contribution of Melucci is the complex societies. This is where novel features of contemporary social movements are related, defined by significant decline of material production and its replacement with the production of science and social relations. Here, power is dispersed, becomes autonomous and neutral, invisible, and increasingly resides and hides in forms of regulation and operational codes. Here, fundamental paradoxes emerge, with core located in education, self-reflexivity, and learning required in order to produce, exchange, and consume information. Aside from stakeholder mobilization, we will also be talking about mediated mobilization. Melucci in 1996, in Alternative and Activist New Media, Digital Media and Society series book, he said that a movement mobilizes because it has gathered the legacy and the resources of pre-existing social structures and has reoriented them towards new goals of transformation. So that is mediated mobilization. It is one of the genres of alternative and activist new media which relates to the domain of political or cultural organizing and social movements. It takes advantage of web-based social software tools like social network sites, personal blogs, flash mobs, and email listservs It is one of the genres of alternative and activist new media, which relates to the domain of political and cultural organizing and social movements. It takes advantage of web-based social software tools like social network sites, personal blogs, flash mobs, and email listservs, as well as DIY digital media to cultivate interpersonal networks online and to mobilize those networks to engage in live and mediated collective action. Mediated mobilization has a scope of being collaborative. It is a process of promoting collaboration among like-minded people. From interpersonal relationships and interaction to the creation and sharing of ideas, opinions, and information via blogs, websites, wikis, email, and listservs, to participation in large-scale live protests, workshops, counter summits, and others. It is not merely the collection and allocation of resources like people, time, funding, technology, and space, but creates a sense of belonging, solidarity, and collective identity among participants that is expressed through their collaborative activities. Mediated mobilization fostered movements that are distinctly heterotropic and subcultural. The social movements depend on activists' abilities to articulate and present their interests and concerns in contrast and opposition to the status quo. Movements, as insurgent forces existing outside the conventional institutions and practices of power, and as necessary and legitimate correctives and challenges to those institutions and practices. In mediated mobilization, network communication technologies have allowed movements to shift from relatively centralized, hierarchical organizational structures to highly decentralized, loosely affiliated contingent networks that link a wide variety of groups, actors, and interests without imposing a single dominant agenda or program of action. Here, communication networks are able to include and enclose cultural diversity and a multiplicity of messages to a much greater extent than any other public space in history. In terms of action and agency, mediated mobilization is fundamentally interventionist in purpose, practice, and ethos. In the society level, it helps movements intervene in the workings of social and political institutions, changing norms and values and reconfiguring the distribution of power and resources. In the middle range level, the use of networked ICTs has led activists to reject the traditional forms of movement organizations in favor of messier, but more direct and participatory forms of political organizing and action. Also, in the middle range level, mediated mobilization enabled a shift from an intensive form of movement organizing to a more extensive form. Cultural logic of networking has been a move toward increasingly flexible, adaptable, and flat social movement organizing. In terms of interpersonal and individual level, it is through mediated mobilization that the prophetic or prefigurative activities of activists who put their values and commitments into practice in their everyday lives as an example to others of how personal action can promote social and political change. Here are my references. Thank you so much for listening.